Welcome to Early Adopter, the podcast where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess, marketing exec by day, AI experimenter by day, night, and basically every other waking moment in between at this point.
And I'm Kyle, your resident tech guru. I've spent the last decade building data systems, products, and AI tools that solve real-world problems. Each week, we'll break down AI concepts, tools, or trends that actually matter for your business. We'll explain what it is, why you should care, and how to use it without needing a computer science degree.
So whether you're a small business owner, an entrepreneur, or you're just tech curious, grab your coffee, close that tab where you've been staring at ChatGPT for the past 3 weeks wondering what to do with it, and let's dive in. Just think of us as your guides through the wild, wonderful, and sometimes completely overwhelming world of AI.
Welcome back to Early Adopter, where we make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Jess. So Kyle, how's your week been?
My week has been very busy. Obviously, I'm back in London where we got to...
It's been great having you here.
Thank you. It's been great to be back IRL and in real life for those. Probably shouldn't be dropping, the Gen Z terminology, but it's been a busy
Gen
week.
Z? I feel like that's for those of us who skew slightly older, but
maybe. Okay. Hopefully I'm not aging myself on that one. But, was at an incredible wedding for my friend Vikas this last weekend as well. Just a really, really wonderful event. I got to see a lot of friends and got to talk a lot about the podcast.
Oh, excellent. Is that why your voice sounds a little gravelly today?
It's a little gravelly. I'm a little light on sleep, but yeah, I got a lot of feedback and a lot of tips from the friends about the podcast. So, and some good stories. So we'll be incorporating a lot of that.
Excellent. Well, I just got back from South by Southwest London, which is the first event of its kind over here. Obviously, South by Southwest is a big music and film and technology conference that happens in Austin, Texas. But this is the first London event that they've had. And they had some teething problems, shall we say. But the actual content itself, what I was able to see was fantastic. And as predicted, AI was basically every other session in some way, shape, or form. And I got to say that the conversation is completely different now than it was even 6 months ago. Like I saw a panel with someone from OpenAI, and even just the conversation around agents and things like that, those weren't conversations that we were being had at the end of last year even. So it's moving so quickly.
Well, that makes a ton of sense based on the research we're doing. Obviously, everything you read about and you're hearing about, the amount of or the volume of content that people are talking about and what they're doing is pretty overwhelming sometimes. And I think there's definitely this like tension between what's technically possible and all the things that we think we can do, and sometimes it sounds overly futuristic, versus what is really creating value. So what were people really talking about in terms of like steps and things that you can be doing now?
Well, I think, I saw a whole bunch of different panels. I saw one with a guy called Demis Hassabis, I think his name is. He's the CEO of DeepMind and heads up AI over at Google. So obviously they've had quite a few announcements over the last couple of weeks. I saw another session that was around AI in 2030. And really the big conversation is kind of moving from like, what can AI do this to like, should AI do this? And really kind of thinking moonshot stuff. So we're really starting to talk about moving from the kind of, it can make my workflow a little bit faster, to the really amazing stuff that it can do. The guy from Google has actually won a Nobel Prize or something in addition to his work. And so his work was really based around healthcare. And like, obviously AI can be doing some insane things in healthcare. So there was a lot of conversation around that. There was a lot of conversation around the ethics of AI and creativity. As we've said endlessly, we feel very strongly that AI shouldn't replace creatives. And I have to say that feeling was really echoed in a lot of the conversations that were had this week. Even the Google guy was talking about his friendship with Darren Aronofsky and how he's working with Darren to help them develop some of those tools so that it really is just the tool rather than completely taking over. And there was another interesting panel I saw that was around AI in the creative spaces. And it was a guy whose brother was an assistant director. And so he kind of was working with his brother to be able to help streamline some of this one was particularly around screenwriting. And it wasn't so much the actual writing of the content, but it was around, organizing the content and being able to keep track of characters and that sort of thing. So it was just a really interesting application of these things as a tool rather than actually replacing the creative elements. So that was great to see.
Yeah, and I think that should be somewhat ease some of those concerns or be somewhat liberating for creators. We're not looking to replace creativity, but use it as an amplification. And I think that's probably consistent with most industries that we're looking at. How do we amplify the people, not replace them?
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see that kind of come through a little bit with some of these big announcements that, some of these CEOs have been making recently, where they kind of were talking about laying off a ton of people and replacing it with AI, and then very quickly realized that actually was not going to work. And they
Absolutely.
brought a lot of those people back. That happened a couple of times in the last couple of weeks.
But any tips
anyway.
or thoughts for our business owner, entrepreneur audience here on what you're hearing about South by Southwest? Anything that they can start doing today?
I think the biggest thing is just to start trying different things. Like that honestly is the biggest thing. And we'll kind of cover that a little bit later on in our AI news. There was a big report that was out around AI this week. And I think the biggest thing is just get in there and try, because there are huge opportunities for companies that lean into AI early. And I think smaller businesses and entrepreneurs and startups are in a really interesting, unique spot because they can be a little bit more nimble and move faster than some of the big institutions. The big institutions are always like cargo ships, that
The
that
cargo
phrase.
ship versus the speedboat problem, right? Like
Yeah, exactly.
turning the big cargo ship like an enterprise versus, being able to pivot in real time and be, like you're saying, adaptable and kind of quickly evolve your processes and what you're doing.
Yeah, 100%. And, we do have to be realistic. There are going to be some pretty big job market changes. There's probably going to be some things, particularly in things like customer service. But for anyone that can move quickly and moves faster than the big guys, you're going to be in a really interesting spot.
All right, let's dive into today's main topic. Custom GPTs. We've both been experimenting with these. We've done a lot. I know we have our own GPTs running in the background for all of our different tools and writing copy, etc. And honestly, they're pretty game-changing once you understand what they are and utilize them.
Yeah, they really, really are. For anyone who might be hearing this term for the first time, a custom GPT is like a specialized version of the large language models that we were talking about over the last couple of weeks. And they've been really tailored for specific tasks or specific industries.
And just like we talked about last week with LLMs being that infinite intern, we mentioned that word, where they know a little bit of everything, but they don't actually have, they're just a really smart person, but they don't have any context about your business. Well, a custom GPT kind of solves that problem. It's the intern that actually understands what you do or your business or your voice, because you've trained the LLM just like you would that real, person, that intern.
So I actually use these almost every day. And where they really differ from the large language models that we've talked about previously is that the customization happens through fine tuning with specific data. You set really explicit instructions or you integrate external tools. So personally, I have a project. I use Claude, and Claude calls them projects rather than custom GPTs. We'll talk a little bit more about the differences. And I've given it a ton of white papers, articles around a really specific area of interest. And that way, when I ask it to write content, it always writes it in that specific context. So I'll use it to write a newsletter, and I need a little summary for LinkedIn and then a longer piece of content for the newsletter. And so it will, because I've written it in the instructions, it will give me that short version first and then the longer version. And all of that is wrapped in previous articles that I've talked about, white papers, so it can pull statistics, all those things. And it just means that I don't have to start from scratch every single time I go to write this newsletter. It kind of comes with that context pre-built in and that knowledge. And then you can also, train it on someone's voice. So I've got it trained on my colleague's voice because she's got a very specific way of talking and explaining things. So it just makes your life so much easier not having to start from scratch every time.
So it is really simple to get started. But once you start to put in that context and that data, and we'll talk about integrations in a second, but once you've put in those documents in those sections of the different tools that we've talked about, that's how it starts to achieve what Jess is talking about, where the LLM can write in your voice and use your actual documents to answer questions, just like a trained team member.
Yeah, and like I was saying, the consistency piece is incredibly helpful. It means that you're not constantly having to give it the context. We talked last week in the prompt engineering episode about how important context is, and constantly having to copy and paste that in or rewrite that is going to get a little tiresome. So this kind of gets around having to do that. And there are really four key features that make these custom GPTs or these projects really powerful. You've got specialization, consistency, integrations with existing systems, which we'll talk about, and then contextual awareness via RAG, or retrieval augment. God, I can't even say that. Retrieval augmentation. And Kyle, do you want to break that one down? It's a pretty technical one.
Yeah, it does sound technical, but on a really high level, it's pretty straightforward. But it's really one of the most powerful things you can do. So RAG, as you mentioned, is retrieval augmented generation. And the idea is that instead of relying only on what the model was trained on, and we talked about this, billions of parameters, massive data sets of everything on the internet, from Reddit to scholarly published articles, etc. The RAG allows you to pull live information from your documents or tools, whether that's your Google Drive, your Dropbox, or a bunch of CSVs. It then uses that data that's in your repository, or goes and searches out the data that it needs, pulls that in to provide context, and kind of gives that as more information to the LLM to be a lot more specific as it's generating the response.
So I know we've mentioned this before, but the different AI providers have different approaches. Like I know OpenAI makes it pretty user-friendly, but they all have their own version. Claude has projects. Google has gems because it's Gemini. Perplexity has spaces. But the basic concept is the same for all of them. They're all no code, and they're all pretty easy to set up. And honestly, the hardest part is probably going to be tracking down all the documents and the content that you need to populate.
Absolutely. And we'll get into some of the pitfalls of, how you probably want to structure your repositories, or your folders, so that you can get the best out of it. But also keep in mind, that's a lot of data that's then sitting there in the background that you don't have to constantly be like copy pasting into your prompt. That's just always there in live that the GPT will go and reference if it thinks it's relevant. So it's kind of like a nice time saver each time. And honestly, doing this, dropping a couple PDF documents into Claude projects, things that you think will be really specific to your business, can take less than 30 minutes to set up once. And once you've done it, you'll always have access to that data in the project or reference. So, it was, as we talked about prompt engineering around our frameworks, that context piece all of a sudden becomes way more, easier. And it also has just way more data in that you probably could each time be providing it.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of frameworks, you could even write a framework into the instructions, because what you do is once you've dropped all of your content into the project, you have to write instructions which is essentially a prompt, and you give it a really strict, structure to what you want it to give you back. And then it's also worth mentioning that you can update the data as well. Like I actually just noticed today that Claude's increased the size of the project knowledge allowed, which means that I can put more white papers in or whatever. I was a little limited in what I could use previously. So it's just, you can constantly update it if you don't have integrations with your Google Drive or anything else.
Yep, absolutely. And then, there are other options out there as well. We keep mentioning ChatGPT and Claude. Obviously, you're probably finding out as an audience that we prefer those tools and we use them a lot. But, we should mention that, Llama, which is Meta's tool, and Gemini also have more technical options for if you want deeper control and more customization. But there's something for every comfort level. So, if someone wants to optimize their custom GPT, and trust me, the first version is never perfect. Jess, why don't you basically run us through how we should start?
Yeah. So the first step is absolutely critical, and it's kind of usually where people fall down, and that is define really clear objectives. Like I was saying, it's essentially just a prompt. And so what you want to do is just make sure that when you're writing out the instructions for it, you're giving it very clear instructions to follow so that it knows what you want to get out of it.
No, I learned this the hard way. Typical me, like I tried to put everything in at once, and it really was just trying to do too much.
Yeah, and I think you should have separate GPTs for separate things. So, for example, I will have my newsletter writing one, but then I might have a different one for something that's a little bit more sales related. And I don't think you can do this with Claude, but with ChatGPT, they can talk to each other. So you can reference another GPT when you're asking a GPT about something. So that's a useful tip as well. But yeah, just having separate ones for different things means that you're not giving it too much to do. And then the other really important thing is, as we've always talked about, the data curation. You have to make sure that your data is high quality, it's specific to you, and you don't just upload it once and leave it, because you want to make sure that it's getting the most constant and fresh information. So as you have new information coming in, as you have new sales numbers or a new playbook or new marketing numbers, you're updating those constantly. So it's not just existing off of old data, because then it's not going to be particularly useful.
This goes back to that RAG term we talked about for providing context. If your context is out of date, or if your context isn't relevant anymore, it's going to be more difficult to actually give you what the prompt needs to be successful.
Absolutely. And RAG is really fantastic when you need up to date responses, because it connects to your existing database. So that's just going to be a lot easier, because you're probably putting things in your Google Drive anyway. It means you don't have that extra step of having to upload it to your GPT. You're just able to use it off of what you have. But RAG is perhaps a little bit more advanced if you don't feel like you're in a space to do an integration quite yet. Just doing a GPT and uploading that data or that white paper or whatever it is going to be perfectly fine and perfectly usable. You don't need to overcomplicate it with RAG at this point in time. You can keep it pretty simple and straightforward with just a standard project or a custom GPT.
So beyond integrations, what other optimization steps should people prioritize?
So like I said, setting really explicit instructions and rules is incredibly important. This is where all of our prompt engineering tips will really come in handy, because again, it's only as useful as the prompts that you give it. And that goes for instructions as well. When you're setting these things up, you do need to be very specific. With my project that I use for the newsletter, I give it a number of characters it can use. I want it to be asking questions. I have a very specific tone that I want it to use. And so all of those are included in the instructions. And then you can keep tweaking it and refining it over time. But generally, you want to make sure that it, for me, I want it answering within the context of the wider knowledge. So I say that it should do that. So just being very specific and using the tips that we gave in the prompt engineering will really help with the instructions and getting it up and running.
Absolutely. I think the testing and iteration piece is so important. I'm constantly iterating on my GPTs, whether that's if I don't have a live integration, I'm updating it with more of what I've written so that it can properly capture my tone of voice. Because also keep in mind, our tone and our style changes a little bit. So as we write or become a little, more knowledgeable about something, that might update like how we talk about it, and your tone of voice should be up to date with you. So if you're doing it for copywriting, it's super important. Or if you're using it for like business and financial analysis, obviously, you want to continually iterate, evolve, and test.
Yeah, as we say, always be iterating. I know you loved that. You love that principle.
I love that. Always. AVI.
AVI. So your first version's never going to be perfect. And, just keep refining, updating the data, and then just testing it on your tasks. And it's going to keep getting better over time.
Yeah. And if you're connecting it to tools like Google Drive, we kind of mentioned this, but make sure your folders are clean and well labeled and a pretty decent structure. Classic garbage in, garbage out. Context only works if the inputs are really high quality. And also keep in mind, needle in a haystack. Sometimes you don't want to throw the whole kitchen sink at it. So you do want to be a little bit curated in what you're providing in there. Although with RAG, it will be able to find the information you want, but you don't want to just throw every single sales playbook that's ever existed in the world if you're trying to run a sales process.
No. And as always, monitor for hallucinations, always double check it. It will never be perfect. You should always make sure that you are double checking the data that comes out of it, because it's good practice, but also you want to make sure that what you're using is correct.
Yeah, and that's where I think for business owners and entrepreneurs, this integration is probably the make or break factor. If it plays well with your existing tools, it's going to feel a lot more relevant, and it's going to be an ever-changing, evolving system with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can make sure that it's connected to all of your different platforms. So whether you've got a customer support platform or you've got a CRM or whatever makes sense for workflow integrations, and the goal is to make it feel natural and not like it's another thing for you or for your team to learn. We'll do a whole separate session on workflows because that's something I personally really love to dig into, and that's kind of a standalone thing, I think,
Yeah,
for today.
I think that CRM piece is huge. I mean, ChatGPT just announced that they would connect to HubSpot. So you can effectively connect your HubSpot account to ChatGPT and use it to start querying on all of your customer information, which is massive. That was something you had
Amazing.
to
Yeah.
build custom before. So I assume based on the evolution of ChatGPT and its integrations, we'll continue to start seeing it connect to more and more tools. And one last thing, as that I think that brings up a really important point, which is don't forget about privacy and security. So if you are dealing with sensitive customer data or you're working in a regulated industry, make sure you understand what data your custom GPT has access to, and also like who can see the results. So governance around what's there, and this is where you probably need to read the terms and conditions of ChatGPT in terms of whether they can train on that data or not, depending on the service you have.
Yeah, 100%. And, as we always say, just because it feels like a helpful assistant doesn't mean that you can ignore governance, particularly if you're in a field like law or healthcare or something where, privacy is a really, really, really big issue. Even, marketing and advertising, GDPR is a big thing over here. And so you want to make sure that you're not accidentally contravening some of these big privacy laws. So, make sure you monitor who can access them, review the integrations, don't give it any training data that you wouldn't share with a contractor or an employee. They all have different levels of shareability. So a custom GPT can be made completely public. So you want to make sure that you don't accidentally make something completely public. Claude doesn't have that. You can share it with, other employees or specific people, but it's not going to, accidentally expose your data to the world. So, it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah. And I think that public versus private, brings up another great point, which is on the, I guess, positive side, there is ChatGPT has a GPT marketplace. So you can find other public and pre-built GPTs. I think they can be a little hit or miss, and they're never going to have your specific data as context. They won't connect to your Google Drive and use RAG from that perspective. But if you need a starting point, or if you kind of just want to test what these look like and get some ideas, the marketplace can be a really good option.
Yeah, the marketplace is a great option actually to get some use cases and some ideas of what other people are using them for. So you can use that as inspiration, which brings us nicely onto some real world examples of what you can use these custom GPTs or projects for.
Yeah, I mean, the one we've kind of been circling around, but let's just dive into it with a little bit, which is the content repurposing GPT. So you could just upload your last blog post or your last couple blog posts and train the GPT on those blog posts to output a few different things, whether it's a LinkedIn post, a tweet, if we can still call it that, and maybe even an email.
Never gonna die.
I know. Or an email summary. Again, all in the voice that you wrote it in from the last few blog posts.
Yeah, and so another good option could be a product copy optimizer. So you can load up a product catalog if you sell physical goods, and you can instruct the GPT to generate the descriptions in different tones, for example. So you can tweak it depending on where you might be selling them. So that's a really interesting use case.
Mm-hmm. Or you could also create like an outbound email writer. So you could feed it your successful email campaigns, the ones that have had really high open rates. So just take those successful email campaigns and then, set clear formatting rules around the subject line, the hook, the call to action, and then all of your new campaigns can be drafted off the successful ones using the same kind of wording and verbiage. It's then going forward, it's going to be really just easy to ask it for this email campaign that's on brand in your voice and for maybe a reason you don't even know was quite successful.
Yeah. So we've got a couple more examples, and I want to make it really clear that we are going to Reddit for some of these examples in the interest of full transparency. Obviously, we are wanting to build a community around early adopter, and we'd love to hear your stories and your use cases. But in the meantime, the good people of Reddit are often a great resource for real world use cases because someone on Reddit has done everything at some point in time. If you ever need anything, it's the place to go. So we've got a couple interesting examples that we pulled from there.
We're not the first group of people to pull,
No.
information from Reddit. I think the most egregious example is the BuzzFeeds, right? Where they're just like, hey, here's what 20 people said on Reddit about this thing. Like zero
that was
shame.
Just lazy writing. That's AI generated content.
Yeah, exactly. But
which one is?
Yeah, I'll talk about this second one here, which I really liked, which was this. I uploaded my organization strategic plan, equity goals, and various other planning and forecasting documents. Then I outlined things like leadership, decision-making, communication styles, and other relevant tidbits about, their bosses. Gave it relevant facts about the industries, regulations, market environment. And so now when they have ideas or proposals they want to share with management, they propose them to the AI and ask it to evaluate given the parameters and what is going on in the industry. So, I mean, that's just really interesting, market and competitive intelligence research that this person's doing. And also, I'm sure in the instructions are asking it to be, weigh the pros and cons and to kind of provide that balance like we talked about in the prompt engineering to really assess whether what they're doing is potentially beneficial.
Yeah, and then the one that I really loved, because I've just been in the depths of website design, which is, if you are not a designer, a very difficult thing to do. Someone on Reddit made one that writes complete WordPress plugins. And if you know anything about WordPress, it is not a particularly easy platform to learn or use. So essentially this person's GPT writes a development plan, and then it writes the code, and then it creates the zip file so that the plugin can be installed and activated right away. And they're not perfect, but they're pretty good. I have to say that there was a tool that I used recently, and it does essentially that. I think it was Manus AI. The image generation one, and it also did a pretty good job with that. So this is just it's a nice workaround because, web design is really difficult if you are not a web designer or developer. And then obviously, we've talked a lot about custom GPTs. We've talked a lot about Claude's projects. Those are not the only ones. We've got Gemini's gems and, other brilliantly named things. So
that is a great name. I actually do love that name.
So do I, but I don't think I'd be able to say it with a straight face. So what we'll do is we'll pull together a little table of the different ones, and we'll put that up on our LinkedIn. So make sure you come and follow us on LinkedIn. We are early adopter without the E in adopter. And we'll have those live so you can see the differences between all of the various platforms.
Yeah, and I think, when we kind of looked at it, to be, brutally honest, there's not much differentiation between them. I think it more comes down to wherever you're using AI. If you're using ChatGPT, use ChatGPT's custom GTs. If you're using Claude, use their projects. If you're using Google, there's nothing really too overly unique about this. It's more about what you put into the repository and the integrations that you're doing. But when you get this right, these aren't just fun AI experiments. When you get this right and it's connected to your data, you can reclaim hours or days of work. And, you can scale your brand, you can scale your analysis pretty exponentially using these tools. Well, before we jump into the news section of this week, I want to check in with the community. We ran a poll asking what content you want to see more of from Early Adopter. And Jess, why don't you run us through the results?
Well, the results are pretty definitive. 67% of you want more use cases and 33% want more examples. So that is what we will be focusing on. And hopefully we've done that today. But I think really it just goes to show, people just want the inspiration.
Yeah, I think, obviously what the feedback is showing from the listeners is we're kind of going past the what is AI phase, kind of maybe, and that kind of fits in nicely with what you were hearing at South by, right? It's not what is AI.
Absolutely.
It's how do I use this and how do I use it for my specific business, industry, what have you, which, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So you guys want to see AI in action and not just hear us talk about it. So message received loud and clear. We're going to be shifting more towards more practical and implementation focused content rather than just doing some education stuff.
Yeah, so keep that feedback coming, everyone. We want to make sure we're solving real world problems, and I think we'll start, the next couple of weeks, start bringing on speakers that can tell us about what they're doing out in the world to give you guys ideas. All right, let's zoom out and talk about what's actually happening in the wider AI world this week, and what it means for businesses and entrepreneurs like yourselves. Jess, this week was absolutely packed. I mean, I feel we say that every week, but definitely this week.
This week was massive. So we've got two major stories that we wanted to focus on for this week that we think will definitely impact or directly impact our listeners. So the first one is someone called Mary Meeker. She's a VC. She has been doing reports on the internet for years, and she has dropped a AI report for 2025. It was over 340 pages, so we can't go through every single one, but we'll certainly highlight some stuff. And then the other really big piece of news that we wanted to cover is that Meta has announced that they are moving towards the full automation of ad creation, which is major news for businesses, smaller businesses, and entrepreneurs.
Mary Meeker's report is always a must read or, a must skim. And everyone...
340 pages is a lot.
Yeah.
That's a book.
The good news is everyone who writes about this everywhere, and, not just ourselves, is talking about this and, summarizing and pulling out the key indicators. But I think...
a lot of graphs as well. It's very visual, so it's not as bad as it sounds.
And you know how much I love a good graph, Jess. So
yes.
But I think
your finance background there.
Exactly. But to really bring the point home of how big this report was, Meeker dropped the word unprecedented 51 times. And she's not usually known for being, over exclamatory.
No.
But and then the other headline that jumped out at me was that AI adoption is happening 5.5 times faster than the internet boom. And we're a few years past that, but I think we all know how important that was. So
yeah, just a little bit.
The fact that adoption is happening faster is, again, going back to somewhat overwhelming, kind of scary, right? But we do need to kind of break it down. And then also, I think what's the other real important bit is adoption, the revenue from this, and the infrastructure investment is also all accelerating faster than mobile, cloud, and desktop internet. So why this matters? I mean, this is obviously a massive paradigm shift. It's not just incremental change like some of the changes in the past, like the internet. It's really redefining speed to market and consumer expectations. This cycle is much faster. I think people feel it, that this is a lot faster and more overwhelming than some of the other ones have been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think here's what's different this time versus the internet. We always talk about we're in the new version of 1994. But what's different this time around is that the democratization is immediate. We've talked about this quite a lot, but the AI tools that cost billions to develop, are available to anyone for $20 a month and subscriptions. And there's no massive capital requirement like previous tech revolutions.
That's massive. I think you're spot on. It levels the playing field right away. Usually it takes quite a bit of time for the adoption curve and kind of that cycle to get to small businesses or startups, whatever it may be. But now, a solo entrepreneur can access the same AI capabilities as a Fortune 500 company. That's pretty wild in terms of all other kind of adoption curves and cycles as we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and more importantly, the productivity gains are real. The report shows that 14% immediately, with some businesses seeing employees accomplish tasks several times faster. I actually was speaking to someone the other day, and he was saying someone on his team automated a process that used to take him 2 hours, and now he could do it in about 10 minutes because he just didn't have to do it manually anymore. But then also what really caught my eye in the report was the cost revolution.
I couldn't believe it, honestly. So the inference costs, what LLMs are doing, dropped 99.7% in 2 years. But it's what's making new business models possible. Services that couldn't be profitable before suddenly make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and we're really starting to see consumer behavior shifting to match. So 800 million people using AI weekly, 800 million is just a mind-boggling number. But I think something that the report flags that is very important to mention is that your customers are going to start expecting AI enhanced experiences, and they'll only get better over time. I know, we've all used a chat bot on a website for customer support and it's not very good. That's going to keep getting better. It's not always going to be this crappy. So people are going to start to expect that. And so you are going to have to start to adapt.
Just to give an example of like that, now people expect 2-day shipping because Amazon provided everyone with 2-day shipping.
That's a great example.
Right.
That's a great example.
And so now if you're a small business and you don't provide 2-day shipping, sometimes that's seen as a friction for the consumer. I also think, if we talk about consumer experience, the accessibility piece is really important here. Before, previous technologies rolled out slowly across markets. Typically, if it started English speaking, it maybe was difficult to translate. Now AI works in multiple languages natively from day one. So that global accessibility piece is, easy from day one.
Yeah, because that really means that anyone can serve a global market immediately. We were talking about it the other week with Google's I/O announcements. They now have real-time translation in Google Meet. Like, that's game changing if you want to work on a global scale rather than just English-speaking territories.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the other really interesting thing was the sector-specific opportunities. So a good example is AI legal assistance grew from 10 million to 70 million revenue in 15 months, 15 months.
Meeker also mentions, the AI coding assistants like Cursor, which I know at some point we want to discuss. It is going to be a little bit more technical and get into the weeds, but I think, it's worth discussing how you could potentially prototype something with these tools. But Cursor jumped from $1 million to $300 million in revenue in just 25 months. I mean, that's not growth. That's not company growth. That's a category explosion.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And it's not just the tools, it's talent too. So the report shows that AI-related job postings are up 448% since 2018, whereas traditional IT roles have actually dropped by 9%. So we're not just seeing a tech shift, we're watching the workforce also rewire in real time. And that's going to have a massive knock-on effect on how companies hire, how you structure teams, and then how those teams deliver work.
Yeah. And that brings us on to the meta news, because this is, not going to lie, this is a bit of a blow for media agencies. The meta news could be equally transformative for small business advertising. They are rolling out AI that will let you upload a product image, set a budget, and then have AI create an entire campaign. Meta has historically been a nightmare to use if you are not familiar with the platform. It's just the most difficult thing on the face of the earth. So this is actually pretty big.
We know this all too well. We tried to build an entire business around this 5 years ago.
Oh my God.
And if Meta can automate that with comparable quality.
Yeah, like the traditional barriers just disappear. That is what we were trying to build. We were trying to simplify the process of running paid social campaigns for small businesses. So this is exactly what we were trying to do. And, it just means that you don't have to have a minimum budget. You can get on there and do it in a matter of minutes rather than going back and forth with an agency. Most businesses can't afford a media agency. So that's, immediately a cost savings. Campaigns are created in minutes instead of weeks.
Yeah, I think, and the targeting capabilities sound really sophisticated, because it's the data set that's being used on all of the ad campaigns that have been run. You're going to have smart geolocation, automatic audience identification. So who's most likely to buy your product? Things that previously required not only deep advertising experience, but just quite a bit of manual work to set up. So you probably didn't do it if you didn't have an agency, because you weren't quite sure and you were worried about maybe making your audience too niche or something like that.
Yeah. And, it used to be that from my dealings with media agencies back in the day, that you couldn't really trust what the platforms told you when it came to recommendations. And actually, as you start to, over the course of time, those automated recommendations and automated targeting and stuff has gotten much, much better. So I think it's finally now at the point where you can just let it run or let it choose, and it's going to be much more trustworthy than it was 5 or 6 years ago.
But as with all things, and I think people who are running meta ads these days are probably noticing the algorithm is adjusting quite a bit. And so performance one week to the other is being a little inconsistent. I'm seeing this with, a friend's business right now. I think you want to always constantly be monitoring and looking at the performance of that as well. So use the new tools that are coming out, but don't completely trust it. Always be checking what's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
This is end of 2025 for a full rollout. So there is a bit of time to prepare. So Jess, what do you think people should be doing now?
So you should start learning Meta's current tools, at least have a look at Ads Manager and just kind of get a feel for it, because you'll start to see how much easier it's going to be. Start organizing your assets and your visual content, so at least it's got something to work with, and then start having a think about your target audiences and who you want to go after. You might, I don't know, if you have a kids product, then obviously you need to think about your target is probably going to be, young parents or young moms or whatever the case may be, but have a think about that. So when the time comes, you have a better idea. And then even smaller budgets are going to go much further with the AI optimization, which obviously when you don't have large budgets to begin with is very appealing.
Right. And as we always say, the businesses that master these tools first will have significant advantage over slower moving competitors. So yeah, take a look and use those tools soon. Jess, not everything in AI land is sunshine and roses. I think the Builder.ai story is a perfect cautionary tale for small business owners. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we're jumping into our favorite AI gone wrong segment. And this is really required reading for anyone who's looking at AI tools. So Builder.ai was a $445 million company that just collapsed because it was essentially built on a house of lies.
45 million. That's a very big company
Yes.
to basically be, not doing what they were claimed to do. So what were they actually doing?
So they claimed to use AI for app development, which was faster, cheaper, automated development and no coding required. So it sounds amazing. Sounds great. The problem is they weren't using AI at all.
Okay, so wait, what was actually happening? Because we use tools like Cursor. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background, so it's hard to fake that.
Yeah, so in the background, they had 700 human engineers in India responding manually. Customers thought that they were getting cutting edge AI, but they were actually just getting outsourced human work with AI marketing on top.
That's some AI washing if I've ever heard it. That's some bold marketing claims going on.
Yeah.
But what were the other red flags just beyond the technology claims? Because maybe that helps, some of our audience identify when these things aren't, quite what they say they are.
Yeah, so they had fabricated customer reviews. They displayed logos of companies they never worked with, which is a really classic deceptive marketing tactic. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. This is actually not the first time that we've seen a similar story. I don't know if anyone remembers those Amazon Go shops from a couple of years ago, where you would just walk in, pick something up and walk out, and it would automatically be deducted from your Amazon account. That came out a couple of years ago. That actually, I think it was last year, that was supposed to be powered by AI. And, they were watching your every move in the store and they could see what you picked up and, calculate the price. But again, it was actually just a bunch of people in India
watching you take things from shelves. It was like such a betrayal. I remember thinking like, oh, this is so cool. And it turns out just nothing.
Really was. I remember going to one by the Amazon headquarters in Seattle, and it was the weirdest. This is when it first launched and there was only one store available. And it was the weirdest feeling because you feel like you're stealing something and you're like, oh my God, this is so strange. But again, built on a house of lies.
And also, I feel like maybe the red flag there was sometimes it took a few minutes before you actually got the transaction receipt, which tells you that, okay, wait a second. It feels like there's a human or there's some level of oversight that's happening. Yeah. It's not just an automatic tool.
But at the time, it felt instantaneous. It felt very impressive at the time.
It felt great. Yeah, it was weird. So, but I think, obviously there's that lag time was a warning sign. If you're, a business or entrepreneur and you're signing for some of these tools, you're going to spend time and effort to try and, get these up to speed. You don't want to be wasting your time on something that ends up like falling down the next day. So what are some other warning signs that business owners, entrepreneurs, professionals should watch for or look out for when evaluating these tools?
So if they can't clearly explain how their AI works, that's probably red flag number one. So vague explanations, lack of transparency, pressure
Mhm.
to commit quickly, pressure on you to commit quickly and sign the deal. That's probably a big red flag.
Yeah, if the tool sounds impressive, that doesn't always mean it's the right fit either. But when I go into a business or when I'm evaluating tools myself, I always go in with a time to value mindset. So you should see early signs of value in as little or as under as 7 days. A lot of tools that we talk about just have, 7 day or 14-day free trials. That should be plenty of enough time to figure out if it works for you. So whether that's faster content, better answers, time saved on repetitive tasks, and then test it with real demo or real data. Don't just do the demo and then sign up.
Yeah, I think, sometimes it's unavoidable to have a white glove service that helps you set something up. But if it's going to be a really long process or it's incredibly time consuming or, you'll get a feel for it, but
What's
just
the
be conscious of it.
Yeah, it's the mismatch. If it's like the demo
Yeah.
shows, instantaneous,
Yeah,
but
that's it.
then when someone's telling you, well, no, we're gonna have to set this up for you, like you said, a lot of services provide that white glove implementation step, and you need that. And that's part of the sell and part of the value. It's when there's like the discrepancy between the two.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. And it also speaks to a broader problem. Like a lot of the time when you're purchasing these things, you really feel the pressure. And especially when it comes to AI, they just slap an AI label on it and you feel that pressure to commit because you know that you should be using AI and you know you need to adopt it. But that actually leads to poor decision making and you kind of sign up for something that maybe isn't quite the right fit.
And the FOMO is real. I mean, that's why
Yeah.
effectively we're here, right? The FOMO is real
Yeah.
and it can be dangerous. Even legitimate AI tools require human oversight. We talk about it's an amplifier, not necessarily a replacement. There's no silver bullet, right?
Yeah, due diligence is really critical. Test it thoroughly, ask really specific questions, check references and see if you can, talk to existing customers. That's a really useful one.
Yeah, and avoid large upfront payments. Most of the tools, the legitimate AI tools offer monthly subscriptions and trials.
So solo entrepreneurs are really vulnerable in these sorts of situations because you've got limited resources and you really can't afford expensive mistakes. So if you stick with proven tools from established companies, then that's probably your,
Yeah, so take a trust but verify approach. Don't let FOMO drive poor decisions. Thoughtfully integrate your proven tools rather than, chasing every shiny new platform.
Yeah, I think the basics are true no matter what tool you're using. And so things like garbage in, garbage out, data quality, prompt engineering, all that sort of stuff is going to be really relevant no matter what tool you're using. So you have to make sure that your basics and the foundations are really solid. And then the businesses that succeed are going to be those that move fast, but smart and not just fast.
Yep. All right, let's give our listeners some immediate action items. Based on everything we've covered today, what can someone start doing this week?
So we've got a couple quick wins. First of all, if you're not experimenting with custom GPTs or with projects or whatever tool you would prefer to use, pick one repetitive task and try building a really simple one. Because even if you save 30 minutes a week, that adds up really quickly. Yeah.
And honestly, the OpenAI ChatGPT interface is user friendly enough to kind of walk you through the steps that I am confident everyone listening can get something basic working 30 minutes or under an hour at least.
Yeah. And then our second quick win is start preparing for Meta's AI ad tools if you're going to be running ads. So organize your product photos, write down who your ideal customer is. And then if you're not running Facebook or Instagram ads yet, you can set up a really basic campaign to kind of learn the platform. And then if you struggle with it, you can see how much easier it's going to be using AI at the start of next year.
Always smart to get familiar with the current tools before trying to, upgrade with AI. And I'm going to add a bonus one, which is join the community or join AI communities. The learning curve is going to be much easier when you're not doing it alone. And it's kind of an inherent review system to understand what's working and what isn't.
Yeah. And of course, we are building our own community. So make sure to keep an eye out for that as we get it up and running. But in the meantime, the OpenAI community forum is really great for custom GPTs. LinkedIn has quite a lot of groups that are really useful. There's a bunch of people out there on TikTok and Instagram that do AI tutorials and stuff. YouTube, obviously. So just keep an eye out for those sorts of things, but obviously prioritize ours first because we're going to be the best.
Of course, absolutely.
Of course, obviously.
All right, well, let's wrap this up. Next week, we'll be looking at how to use deep research, and we'll be recapping London Tech Week, which we're going to go to starting tomorrow.
Right. Starting tomorrow. And then based on your poll feedback, we're going to be focusing more on real world examples. So as always, if you've implemented AI in your business or you have any specific challenges, reach out to us. We'd love to help and talk it through with you.
Yeah, if you're getting value from Early Adopter, please take 30 seconds to leave a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you're listening. Those reviews will help us get found by other entrepreneurs and business owners, and so we can continue to grow that community.
Yeah, seriously, reviews make a really big difference. And even, a quick star rating helps us reach people who could benefit from the podcast. And also don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss episodes as they come out. We come out on a Wednesday, but obviously we're starting to get a little library of content now. So we want to make sure that you aren't missing any of them. And, the AI landscape moves so quickly that staying current is really important for maintaining a competitive advantage.
I'm looking at you, fam and friends, having to, post the new episode every week in the family chat. You just got to subscribe.
Exactly. That'll make everyone's life so much easier.
Way easier. And then links to the Mary Meeker report, the meta advertising news, and some custom GPT resources will be in our show notes. So if you follow us on LinkedIn and our other socials, we get up running the next few days, you'll be able to, get all of that. But until next week, keep experimenting and always stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Early Adopter, where we help make AI your unfair advantage. I'm Jess.
And I'm Kyle. We'll see you next week for Deep Research. Bye.
Bye.